Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. Uh, this is part two of a four-part series that we're calling a phased approach to legacy modernization. This one is going to be focused on executing your project. Just a little bit about Astadia. We've got roughly 25 years of experience in these kinds of legacy modernization projects. We've done scores of successful modernizations for companies in just about every industrial vertical you can name, including companies like Raytheon, United Health, and the U.S. Army. And of course, we're also very, very proud of the fact that we've been a leading partner with Micro Focus for just over 23 years. Our speaker today is Craig Marble. He is our Solution Director in Legacy Modernization. Craig has been in the information technology business for over 25 years, and the vast majority of his experience has been focused on leading and driving a lot of these large legacy modernization projects. He's also spent time in product management, pre-sales management, as well as delivery management. So Craig, with that, I will hand the reins over to you.
Great. Thanks, Greg. I appreciate it. Welcome again, everybody, and appreciate you being with us here today. And we'll just jump right in. For those of you who were able to watch or attend the first webinar, I'm just going to give just a quick review of what we discussed there so we can pick up where we left off. So in the first webinar, you may recall, we talked about preparing for your modernization project, and that was really defining why you want to modernize, what the drivers were for your modernization project, determining the end state vision for your company, where you wanted this project to lead you, where you wanted it to be at the end of the project, documenting where you are today, because you can't get to where you want to go until you know where you are, and then using all that information to develop your modernization strategy. So really the fundamental foundation for any project, and modernization projects included, is really the people and the process and the products. And what we're going to be talking about today is executing that modernization project, focusing on these three areas. And again, that's people, the process, and the products. And starting out with the people. In my humble opinion, choosing the right team is really the most important aspect of your modernization project. And that is, again, in my opinion, even more true than any other project. Now, some may argue with that, but again, this is based on my experience. And it is really the first step to ensure that your modernization project is successful. So it's important to select your team extremely carefully. You want to choose people who are very knowledgeable about the system that you want to modernize, but not so cemented in the way things are done today that they aren't open to the modernization process as a whole. So they should be enthusiastic about modernizing and moving to the new platform or the new language or whatever your end state is, and be able to embrace that change as something that's positive. And we have had, issues in the past where folks they don't want to modernize, and they're on the project and they do it grudgingly, and it just can make the project a lot more difficult, and it could even lead possibly to a failure. Of course, all the folks on your team need to be able to work well in a team environment. Some folks are really good at that, some folks not so good. So make sure that they are team oriented. And you need to be aware of what you might call passive-aggressive helpers. So we have had in past projects on-site resources, meaning customer resources, who were very eager to help, very excited. They had a lot of knowledge about the application, and we thought, man, this is going to be great. And then, unfortunately, it turns out that the motive was a little more nefarious because they were the ones who were really the big detractors of the project, throwing wrenches and kitchen sinks and anything they can grab into the project, trying to get it to stick, to really try to just make it as difficult as possible. Now, the project did succeed finally, but it would have been a lot more comfortable and a lot easier had that not happened. So it's just important, really the most important thing, because most project failures are due to the technology. It's really due to the people and the politics of modernization. So next, we move into the process of your modernization project. The first bullet point we talked about last time, and that was the research and analysis piece. What we're going to be talking about today is moving into the planning and the design phase, the code remediation piece, the data migration piece, and then other ancillary processes around those applications that you're trying to modernize. And then we're going to save the testing, the training and education, and the implementation for the next webinar series. So for those of you who saw the previous webinar or attended, you'll remember this graph, which is a very important deliverable from your analysis phase, and that is using a grid to map out your applications and the value they bring to your business versus the cost of running those applications, also related to the types of architecture that you've chosen strategically, et cetera. So this was sort of the outcome of the last webinar, and that is getting this nice grid showing your visual representation of your current portfolio. So the next step is using that to plan and design your strategy and your modernization project. So what you want to do is use that grid to then map all of your source systems to a target approach. And the reason I say target approach is because you may not want to do the same thing for all systems. For example, you may have what I'm just putting on here, some samples, like an employee time reporting system, systems that your internal folks use to record their time. Well, it's not really a strategic application for you. It's not, unless that's something that you offer as your line of business, but generally speaking, it's just a method of recording time, right? So maybe there's a package that can provide that functionality for you. You don't necessarily have to go through the process and pain of migrating or modernizing that application, unless it is something that you just really want to do. Same might be true of something like a financial management package. Maybe there is a cloud provider that has a ready-to-go solution, something that's, you know, a turnkey solution for that you could just move your data into and use that and retire the system that you already have. So then you get into something that may be more specific to your line of business, like maybe regulatory compliance reporting, which is pretty important. So maybe that's something that you want to keep, and maybe it's easiest for you, or strategically speaking, makes the most sense for you to migrate that to maybe a Windows platform. And then maybe you've got something like a CRM application, which, you know, hey, CRM can be a dime a dozen depending on how you look at it and who you ask. So maybe there is another package solution that you could fit that into. And then there's your real strategic applications. In this case, I'm just using claims processing as an example, because if you're in an insurance company, a lot of times the things that you do as an insurance company and the systems, products that you offer are often related to how you perform those processes in your IT system. So this could be a competitive differentiator for you, and isn't necessarily something that would be well suited for a package application or some type of provider that's cloud-based. So maybe you want to move that to Linux. So that's just another example. So you want to go through all of those applications that you saw on the previous diagram, and then make a grid and map them out to the target approach, the target platform, et cetera. So in this planning and design process, there are a lot of things you want to consider in determining how you're going to handle these specific applications. One of the biggest is the language that application is written in. So if it's a programming language that's very esoteric, maybe it's old, maybe it's not used anymore except in your specific environment, legacy environment, then that's something that might be a better candidate for a rewrite versus migration. You may not even find support for that on another platform. Is the application that you're in question that you want to modernize, does it have a lot of tight integration with the operating system? And this is true of some things such as like the I-Series applications, COBOL running on that, they tend to be more closely integrated to the operating system. So these are some things you need to take into consideration when you talk about how you're going to modernize them. The database requirements is another important factor. What is the state today? What is the state that it needs to be in? What's the nice to have? What's the must have? So keep in mind the database requirements for that. Is it something that you need a separate server for? Is it something that can live in the cloud, et cetera? And then, of course, I touched on that briefly, the competitive advantage. Is this application something that really sets you apart from the rest of your competitors? And if it is, then you don't necessarily want to just move to a packaged solution that is one size fits all. This is something that sets you apart. So that's something that's more strategic to you. Therefore, a packaged solution may not be sufficient for that. Are there cloud services available for the functionality of the applications that you're working with? Maybe you don't need to rewrite it. Maybe you don't need to migrate it. Maybe it's something simple, again, like the time reporting system that can just be used to use a package in the cloud. And then you need to think about what sort of approach you're going to take for your migration. Do you want to do a phased approach or a big bang approach? So a lot of times, big bang works really well. Your employees go home on a Friday. You have a cut of a weekend, Monday morning, or maybe it's a holiday weekend. Maybe they come back on Tuesday morning and they fire up their desktops and start working, and they don't even realize it, but they're working on a modernized application that's running on a different platform. So maybe that's the best approach. Maybe it's better for you to try not to do everything at one time. Maybe it makes sense to, let's say you have a portfolio of 10 large applications, maybe you move a couple at a time. So it just really depends on your specific requirements. And then always keep in the back of your mind planned events. So you don't want to get halfway through your migration project and then find out that, oh, we are doing a data center move and everything is going to be focused around getting that data center move, or even an office move. So make sure that you take those into account when you are making your plan, finding your plan. And then, of course, holiday and vacation schedules are an important piece to remember because they can trip you up. And then some of the actions to take in this planning and design phase, the very first thing you need to do is baseline all your components. So you've done the research, you've got that source code identified, throw it into some system control, source control product, and adhere to those standards. Always adhere to that. So you need a baseline of what you starting with, so that if you make changes, you need to roll back, or you need to take a look at something before it was changed, you have that baseline. And again, we talked about this. Map out your approach for each of the systems, starting with the systems that are lower priority or the systems you want to sunset. So start easy and then work up to the more complex applications and situations. Another important piece that often gets overlooked is the test cases and collecting all of the test cases beforehand, because before you get to the point where you want to test what you've modernized, you need to identify the gaps in the testing. So maybe you've got 50% of the test cases that you really need. So during that migration project, you're going to need to develop those other 50 cases. You also need to, at this point, define your acceptance criteria. What is the service level agreements you have to meet? What are the acceptance criteria required by your operations folks? They may say, we are not going to let you put this into production until we feel comfortable with how the new application operates in the new environment. So you need to make sure that you understand the acceptance criteria for all of the stakeholders on the deployment side. And then create your project schedule, taking into account all of this information, the approach, any planned events, holiday schedules, et cetera, and develop your project schedule. And then lastly, but certainly not least, is developing a communications plan. And that means not just communication within the project team itself, but externally to your other employees and your other developers who are affected by this, because they're going to be a lot more receptive to what you're doing if they know what's going on. And also don't forget about your partners, and if it affects your customers, of course, you need to communicate that to them as well. So communication is important. Next, we move into the code remediation piece. Now, this is probably the most obvious piece, especially if you are going to modernize by moving to a new platform and preserving the legacy application as much as possible, which is really kind of the approach I'm taking for the rest of this. So the key thing here is to employ automated tools and processes to help you modify the code. Okay, so what you're really looking for is identifying, and we have tools to do this to help us out, otherwise it wouldn't be feasible, is to identify only the pieces that you need to change. So you're not going to be changing, wholesale business logic. What you're really focusing on, again, in a migration situation, is accessing the new data sources, right? So if you're going from, let's say, a mainframe environment to a Windows environment or a Linux environment, those new that data is going to be residing on a different platform more than likely. So you need to find all the places in your code that access data and tell it, here's the new data source. Okay, that needs to be updated. You may need to replace hierarchical data access methods with SQL-based data access methods. And then, of course, comp fields that are going from, say, a mainframe to a distributed platform. Again, there are changes there. So these are the pieces, the parts of the code that you need to look for. And then you will also need to modify what I would call platform-specific logic. For example, sorting is done differently on the ASCII platform than it is done on the FTDIC platform. So those types of changes also need to be looked at. There will be some effect to the business, but of course you want to try to keep that intact as much as possible to reduce risk. But there will be some changes specifically to support it to sorting logic, and also you'll be looking for unsupported calls to the operating system that needs to be modified in some way. And what's important here is to comment out, don't delete. So yeah, you've got a baseline, but really the best practice is you want to keep the old code in there. So if somebody's going to do maintenance, they may need just to reference that old code for some reason. So just comment out the lines of code that that are going to be replaced, and then insert new code in place of that, and notate all of the new modified code. So again, these are just standard-based best practices for doing code remediation. And as I've said, you need to really preserve the business logic. I mean, that's the whole point behind going from one platform to the other and staying in the same language, is preserving the investment in that business logic. So what you want to do is change only the parts that are necessary. And one thing that you can trip yourself up on, and we try not to do this unless the customer just has a burning need for it, is don't try to enhance the functionality while you're doing the migration. It's best to move everything over, verify that it works as it did on the old platform, on the new platform, and then start looking at the enhancements. So don't try to do both at the same time, because it'll just cause you a headache. And this is all an iterative process. So the way we work in our factory facility is we identify in the sampling of the code, the pieces that aren't working, or the pieces that need to modify. We update our rules for our filtering process, and we run the code through the filtering process. And it makes the modifications that need to be made. And then we compile the code, and then we get, okay, this program compiles cleanly, this program had an error on these lines, and so we go through, take a look at it. If it's something that applies to a lot of programs, then of course we add that rule to the filter and run the code through again. Or if it's just something that's unique to that one program, we'll go ahead and change it by hand. And then you go through and recompile, and you really are just doing this as an iterative process until you get clean compiles and are ready to move forward into the testing phase. And of course, once you are ready to start testing and you're ready to move forward and stop the filtering process on a given program, it is important to check that into source control. I can't emphasize enough how important it is in this process to keep up to date on your source control environment. Next, we move into data migration. So this is the other big chunk of work. Depending, of course, on your specific environment requirement, it could be more intense than others. So this is really where you use automated tools. We have a set of automated tools in-house and tools, and you analyze the source database. Let's say you're going from, I'll just take an example, a DMS2 database, which is hierarchical based, kind of like an IMS database, going to a SQL database. So you analyze the old database, and we run it through some tools, and we come out with the definition of the new database. So we take the data definition of the old database. From that, we create definitions for the new database, the tables, etc., and then also create extract, transform, and load programs. So when we get down to the point where we're ready to do code migration and some testing, we have programs that will extract data from the previous database, transform it, and then load it into the new environment. So that's what I mean by ETL programs. And then you also need to handle platform-specific requirements, again, such as going from a hierarchical type of database or a flat file to a relational database. You'll have to do ASCII to EBCDIC conversions again at this point. And then, of course, there are comp fields that are handled differently on different platforms, so you'll need to pay special attention to those as well. And then you may have application-specific requirements. For example, there is a package called Curum, and it has a very special type of key on the mainframe that does not correspond so easily to the key on the distributed side, the package that runs on the distributed side. So there may be situations where you have in this case, it was a package solution running on a mainframe, and there is a equivalent on the distributed side, but the data doesn't always match up for the two systems, even though they do the same things and are provided by the same company. So there may be some application-specific requirements for your data. You also need to define your data validation process. So people are going to want to know, does this data look the same, or at least the way it should on the target platform as it does on the source platform? It may not look exactly the same, which that's the trick, right? You're moving from one database platform and product to a different data platform and product, and so the data isn't always going to be a one-for-one match. So you need to come up with a process that you feel comfortable validates your data migration. We do things like checksum on fields, doing row counts, and then you may want to, in some cases we've had customers who have special test cases run against the database post-migration, just to do a sanity check to say, yes, all this data looks good. And of course, in your testing process, you will identify issues with the data. So really, automation is key in all of this. We have a project under our belt where we migrated something like, I don't know, it was a total of 72 terabytes, but 18 terabytes of data had to be moved over in a relatively short period of time. And this is where you may want to do some dry runs if you have a particularly large amount of data, and you need to do that in a very specific window of time. You'll want to do some dry runs on that, which is what we did. And we actually developed, as part of this particular project, a data migration tool that has quite a bit of functionality. This data migration tool actually builds out the new database, converts the data as it's migrating it, and then validates it after it's been migrated. And it also supports multi-threaded migration. For example, you have several data types. You may have blob data, right? Blob data is difficult to move, not difficult, but slow because of the nature of the data, whereas just plain old alphanumeric data is much easier to move. So it has what you might call data type intelligence, and we set up threads, and you may have 4 or 5 threads working on blob data that moves relatively slowly, while at the same time you may have 60 threads, alphanumeric data, all transforming and migrating simultaneously. And this not only improves the speed at which you can migrate data, but also reduces the errors and it improves the scalability.
Yeah.
So,
hey, Craig, I'm sorry to interrupt.
yes.
You're talking about blob data. I don't know if that's an industry term or not, but could you kind of explain what you mean by blob data?
Yeah, sorry. So blob data is just a word, I think it's called a binary large object data. And that's things like pictures and videos. So this particular customer, they had, it wasn't quite an insurance company, but basically an insurance company. So they had a lot of videos of specific situations, a lot of pictures, and in fact that was their largest growing data type was blob data. So that is it's very different from alphanumeric data. It's slower, it takes longer to move just because of the nature of the data. It's not easily compressed, etc. So that's what we mean by blob data.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. So once you have your database process under your belt and going, then and keep in mind, a lot of these things are done simultaneously by multiple teams. So these are not serialized processes. In fact, we normally have a team that works on the data at the same time as we have the team working on the code remediation. And we also have a team working on these next pieces, which are all of the ancillary supporting systems. So, for example, let's say you're going from a mainframe to a distributed environment. Well, development in the world today on that mainframe is done on the mainframe, either through, most likely through a terminal emulator. Maybe there are some desktop tools that will transfer over, but more than likely, if it's a big mainframe shop, they're going to be using ISPF or some other type of mainframe product to do their development. So that environment is going to be very different in the new distributed world. So somebody needs to take a look at what are the requirements for my new desktop development environment. How is that configured? How is it going to be delivered? Am I going to load all the products on everybody's machine? Am I going to deliver it through a virtualized environment that is easy for me to copy once I have it all configured and have all the tools in there, copy it, and then push it out to different users? So all of that needs to be looked at and worked on and put into place in parallel with the rest of the project. The same is true for source control. So maybe you have ChangeMan or some other mainframe source control product on the mainframe. Well, that's going to be moving to a network-based tool. So that environment needs to be defined. How is it going to work? It will work a little bit differently than it does on the mainframe. The build process is going to work differently. For example, if you have a desktop development environment for something like COBOL, you're going to have a tool that more than likely does the compiling on the desktop. So you're not going to send off a batch job and wait for it to run. So that whole development process is going to be tweaked. The same is true for testing. So you're going to be doing testing perhaps on a desktop environment, meaning I have everything I need in my little sandbox in my world to do testing on the programs that I'm working on, meaning post-migration, right? This is maintenance going forward. So am I going to have my own environment, my own sandbox, or am I going to have a shared environment? Do you prefer to have developers share certain environments and have, let's say, for example, a unit test environment that is theirs and theirs alone, and then maybe as you go up to integration and systems testing, you have a shared environment. All of those environments need to be defined. They need to be you need to have somebody stand them up and verify them, etc. And related to that, you're going to have changes into how programs are promoted from one level to the other. So, and then there's a difference in how you maintain test data. So in a recent project, we had a customer who would only test on certain days because that was the day that they had room to put their databases out there, right? Well, that's going to be different in the new world. So the frequency at which you can test and the way you do testing and the way you manage your test data is going to be different in the new modernized world that you're going to. You also need to take steps to address your security, right? So in the old world, you would have had RACF, maybe ACF2, and in the new world, you're probably going to be using Active Directory or LDAP or some combination there. So you're going to need to migrate and map the users from RACF to Active Directory. So in our experience, the actual act of moving the user data and the permissions over from one environment to the other isn't really that hard. It is the analysis work that needs to go into it to determine what goes where. That is the more difficult piece. And then perhaps some of the timing is it can be a little tricky too. But so you need to have somebody take a look at security and have a team that focuses on that. And then we come to output, meaning output management, content management, and printing. A lot of printing has been replaced by PDF, so maybe it's not an issue. Maybe you've got a group that still uses printing, mainframe printing. So you need to check that out and make sure that you have a solution that takes all that into consideration. And then on the operations side, so there are going to be a lot of changes, right? Because they're not going to be, if you're not going to be running on the mainframe anymore, if you're going to be running on a distributed environment, your operations environment is going to be very different. And how your operations folks maintain and monitor your applications and resolve problems is going to be very different. So that aspect of your project needs to be, again, needs to be stood up and validated and make sure that your folks know how to do it. And also there is an opportunity here perhaps to maybe have some of it on premises and some of it in the cloud, maybe all of it in the cloud. So be sure to take all of that into account when you're doing your modernization project. Oh, and I missed one. The last one on there is disaster recovery. So this is an important piece. Your disaster recovery is going to change significantly. Now, okay, significantly, maybe not in the entire process is going to change, but as part of your disaster recovery, you have, you know, let's just simplify. Let's say there's 10 steps, and 3 of those steps are, you know, doing an IPL on the mainframe and which pieces get loaded first. Well, obviously, that is going to have to change. Virtualization has made this a lot easier. But you definitely are going to have to modify your disaster recovery procedures and then validate that those new disaster recovery procedures are in effect workable. So, so then we get to the last piece, which is products. I mentioned that people are the most important. They are. Products, there are a lot of great products out there, and for the most part, all of them work very well. But they still are an important piece of this. I don't want to downplay the importance of products. They will make the project a lot smoother and a lot easier depending on the particular approach that you take. Make sure you pick the products that are best for that approach. So some that come to mind specifically and for me is, again, the software development lifecycle management products, the source control. This is very important, especially since you're making major changes, modifications to an applications that are critical to applications that are critical to you. So you want to make sure you get a good source control product, do a baseline, and then follow that SDLC very closely. So some products that we've used and have been very happy with are, of course, Team Foundation Server from Microsoft. That's a standard product today. MicroFocus has some good tools, including Star Team. Or you may want to go to some of the open source products that are they're pretty good, and people stand by them, and that is something like Subversion or Subversive. Those are some good products there. You're going to need some good analysis tools. We use, for most of our projects, a tool called Enterprise Analyzer from MicroFocus because it's just a really good product, and it covers a lot of languages. And I don't mean just legacy languages. It covers some of the newer languages as well. So it helps. In fact, that's what we would use to get that grid where you map out your applications based on their value and their cost. So analysis tools are a must-have for this. There are other ones. Enlighten comes to mind from CAST Software. And there are open source products out there as well. But the nice thing about products that are licensed from a software company is that if there's an issue with the product, you have somebody to call to fix it. Open source can sometimes be a little tricky. You're going to need a new development framework. Now, chances are you probably have some sort of standard development environment, but the two main frameworks for today are Microsoft Visual Studio and Eclipse. And Eclipse, of course, is the open source that was put out by IBM. So you're going to need to make sure that you have the development framework required to handle your modernization, as well as the third-party plugins that you might need, or other development tools that you might need. For example, we have a development tool specifically made for Unisys COBOL, and that is XGen, and it's a separate IDE. So depending on what you're doing in your modernization project, your development framework is going to need to modify and get the right products for it. And then there will be tools that are specific to your approach. And what I mean by that is if you're going to, let's say, migrate from mainframe to distributed, certain tools that are required for that certain approach. So MicroFocus Enterprise Developer and Enterprise Server are probably have the lion's share of its market. That is proven technology, 30-some years old. We also have at Astadia OpenMCS, which emulates the Unisys environment, which works in conjunction with the other COBOL compilers, such as the MicroFocus compiler. So that would be for use for people who want to move their Unisys applications, specifically COBOL, onto a distributed platform and preserve that COBOL code. And then there are other tools. Oracle has ART, which is essentially the Tuxedo product, which has worked very well for migrations in the past. There are some that do not have runtime fees. Speaking mostly about GT Software's Net COBOL. So the advantage there is that you have some reduced costs. However, you also are getting services for that runtime software in the form of technical support. So you need to make sure you balance your needs there. And then there are open source products such as COBOL IT. There are tools or really companies or services that would be related to a conversion approach. So you may want to have Astadia do some conversion for you. You may want to have something like a TSRI that focus on converting certain languages. So those are some tools you may need to acquire. And then if you're going from the mainframe to the distributed side, you're also going to have to acquire and replace your scheduling products. So that could be something like Control-M. They do have versions that run on a distributed platform, or an AutoSys from CA, or even a whole new player such as JAMS. Or you may want to find some other way of scheduling your jobs. It's really up to you, but you just have to make sure you take into consideration purchasing those tools. So I'm going to move in now into, again, in my opinion, the top mistakes that are made in executing your modernization project. And as you can probably tell from my my speech earlier, picking the wrong team is really one of the top mistakes. Again, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to have the right people running your project. So top mistake, certainly top one, is picking the wrong team. Next one is trying to do too much at one time. And we have run across customers in the past, and they want to do a modernization project. A big part of that was getting rid of their mainframe expense, but they also want to do to add a bunch of functionality, do all kinds of new user interface development work, and it's just too much to do at one time. And it gets too confusing, adds too much risk. So you really need to do baby steps. Now, well, not baby steps, but small pieces that are chewable. So get it working in the new environment, and then start adding onto it with the new functionality, the new user interfaces, etc. Another top mistake is project scope creep. This one is hard because it's easy for things to creep in the project. We had projects where we were hired to migrate the data, and we asked the customer to give us the dump of their existing database, and well, they didn't know how to do that, so we had to do it for them. And then it became, well, how do we set up a way to easily create test data from this? And so we ended up doing that, and it really just kind of added a lot of creep, a lot of extra scope to the project. So try to pick your scope of the project and try your best to keep it focused. Not communicating is another top mistake. We were very excited at one company. We were close to rolling out and cutting over, and the employees had no idea what was going on. The development staff had no idea what was going on and no idea what it was they were going to be supporting, and it really put a damper on the party. So make sure that you regularly and openly communicate what's going on with the project. And then the next top mistake is performing other major IT projects while modernizing, and that is harkens back to my earlier statement about, you don't want to get into the middle of a project and find out, oh gosh, we're going to have a data center move in the next 3 weeks. Or you don't want to get into a modernization project and find out that you're going to embark on a enhancement project on your legacy application to provide 50 new function points that's then going to have to be retrofitted into your modernized project. Now, it can be done. I'm not saying that it can't be done. It's just it adds a lot of time and expense and risk to the project. So avoid it if at all possible. So the next webinar is going to focus on testing and implementing your solution, and that includes the testing, the test cases, education, and doing the actual cutover. And so from there, I'm going to open it up to Q&A.
Okay, Craig, thanks very much. We do have 2 questions here.
Sure.
I guess going back to roughly slide 11 when you were talking about planning and design, things to consider. You just touched on it a minute there, but the question came in, when is the best time to plan for training and change management?
Okay, well, change management is something that needs to be at the forefront, right? It needs to be considered right from the very beginning. So that is right from the start. The training can come later. So you don't want to train folks too early, because I know from experience, and I'm not saying as an instructor, I'm saying as a student, you can go through a week of training, and then if you don't have anything real to work on, a couple weeks later, you've forgotten everything in that class. So it can be difficult, and you may have to change your dates around depending on the project. So if the project dates shift, your training dates may shift. And you may also find throughout the project that what you are going to provide in training will change, so the content will change. So it is something you should start planning for from the beginning, but not something that you should actually do until you get closer to the end of the project. So ideally, you would roll out the training maybe a month or so before you actually are going live, and in that month before between the training and going live, have the developers who went through the training start helping out with some of the defect resolution, some minor defect resolution between the two.
Okay, very good. There's one other question. A bit ago, you talked about the business logic and changing only what's necessary. The question is does business logic typically carry over, from one language to the next?
So yeah, the actual business logic itself doesn't change. The business rule doesn't change. The code does, right? So if you've decided that you're going to rewrite the application in a new language, what you'll need to do is do a requirements study and a business rules mining project to mine the business rules out of the legacy application and turn those into requirements for the new application. So the business rules will translate, it's just the actual coding may not. Now there may be some reuse of code depending on the source language and the target language. But typically speaking, when you're doing a rewrite, the sort of the spirit of the rule, the language will remain, but the coding itself will change.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Craig. We have no more questions at this point, so I just want to thank everybody for making it to today's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks for part 3. Thanks, everybody.